Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk about a gnoseological problem, the problem of knowledge and things related to that, with regards to our society. So, the bigger picture of society, if you wish. And it would be all about like understanding the society at large, perceiving it even, and how do we arrive at these perceptions that we have and the problems associated with this process. So mostly I'm going to be stating a problem, a particular one, again see below, and not like giving any sort of solution. So unfortunately I should add. So okay, what's the problem we're going to be talking about? Well, firstly, I'm going to probably give like more of a, I don't know, like low-level sort of quasi-conspiratorial edge to it, whereas later on I'll try to sort of develop it into a more general consideration of gnoseological sort, of philosophical sort, you might say, like less of a everyday experience type of consideration, but whatever. So how do we perceive society? How do we even think about society, right? Well, obviously firstly we need some data, some perceptions of society, right? In order to even think about the society. So the problem we immediately encounter when we're talking about the society as a whole, the bigger picture of society, is that your data, the data that you can acquire by whatever means, is localized. It is, it characterizes like your position first and foremost in the larger structure, right? So you can only perceive like, I don't know how many people, but not many people. At least not many people you know too well, you know. You probably don't even know yourself, for that matter, too well. So the data is necessarily localized, incomplete, biased, etc. Like you might say, well, there's all kinds of biases of that sort, like confirmation types of biases. Like people often tend to, let's say, overestimate the amount of the prevalence of emotions and perceptions and things like that they experience themselves, right? So I might think that there are many more supporters of my idea, whatever the idea is, in the society than actually there is, right? Or something to that effect. And of course it is biased because of people's age, like ethnicity, occupation, hobbies, like all those things I talked about in Adopted Ideas video, Adoption of Ideas, I think it was called. All those things. So they bias your perception of the society, right? So any sort of generalization you might make based on this localized data you have would be wrong, obviously, right? Because, well, who is going to guarantee that all the society is like whatever little circle you can perceive from your position? Nobody, right? So this is the problem. This is the problem of the bigger picture that we're discussing in this video. So now we might ask, well, who can have more objective data, more like comprehensive sort of material to work with? Well, you might say, well, there are specialized agencies like statistical services or whatever agencies that work with those things. I mean, not only with regards to society, but let's say with regards to like geography or whatever stuff like this, where we need large amounts of data to work with the thing, right? So, well, the question is, okay, so let's assume we have an agency that has relevant, objective, sociological data. Like, would they just give it to us? That's the question. And, well, maybe that's the wrong question, but anyway, well, let's put it this way. If they have such data, no, that's even a wrong way to point it out. Well, let's well, okay, let's start from a different thing. Any such agency, if it exists, is going to be an interested party, okay? And they might be interested in both, or like through secondary means, like there may be other interested parties that influence them through other like political networks, that bias their opinion, let's say, or bias the information they provide, even though they have the true information in their secret vaults or whatever, right? So they might be influenced by secondary means. They might be influenced like intrinsically. They might be interested in one outcome or the other, like one set of data versus the other. So they might be giving you biased data because of that, etc., etc. So you can see how extremely complicated this problem becomes. And again, I wish to reiterate the main problem, the main issue of the bigger picture. The main issue is that nobody has a bigger picture. And these organizations that are supposed to have this information about the bigger picture, they're not objective, not by any means, right? That's the problem we're talking about. At least in this narrow, half conspiratorial sense, right? Not in the most deep philosophical level. I'll probably mention, I'll probably say a couple of words about that too, a bit later. Okay, so the issue with all of that is that data always implies some sort of narrative behind it. Like I mentioned in my video, Nature of Knowledge, knowledge is the bunch of stories, right? So the numbers don't even exist without the story behind them, let's say. Let's say if you count the numbers of car crashes, like it's a story. A car has crashed and whatever. It's a story, and you count the number of those stories. But without this story, and without perhaps even a larger scale stories, it's impossible to even count, right? So even the numbers don't exist. And the larger scale of the story over a larger scale, let's say, might be our roads are bad, we need to put more money into them, okay? Or another set of stories might be like, we need to tax car producers more, or we need to tax imported cars, or we need to do whatever the heck we need to do, right? So there's a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of political and economic and whatever interests involved in this number. Like behind this number, there's a clash of ideologies and theories and points of view and political positions, etc., etc. So this is what I'm talking about. And this bigger picture of the amount of car crashes, well, okay, maybe I'll return to this issue a bit later. Well, no, let's give the point right here, that we cannot be sure that the amount of car crashes, let's say, as an example, that we are given by statistical bureaus or whatever is even true. Because, well, again, nobody has this information, you see. It's like provided by them, whoever they are in this agency. And God only knows who are they influenced by, right? Some other they, probably. And there's basically, and again, this is basically the main point of this video, that there's no way to confirm or like disprove this claim that, let's say, in the month of January there were 151 car crashes in this country or whatever, in this city. It's impossible to falsify or verify fundamentally, and that's the problem of the bigger picture. You can see a car crash like on the street next to you, but you have no idea what happens on the larger scale. Or you can never see a car crash and you would see a report that there was like a million of them in this year or all over the world. All right. So this is the issue of the bigger picture that we're talking about. And again, so the data is always embedded in the narrative. As I've stated before, and the narrative is always constructed, like meaning that it depends on the point of view. It's not objective, not by any means. Again, as I've stated in the Nature of Knowledge video, any story needs a narrator, right? So it needs a point of view, like, to even see, right? You cannot see if you don't have a point of view, or at least, 2 points or whatever number of points. Vision would be impossible. You cannot see from all the sides, because you would see nothing, essentially, right? All right. Or you would see yourself, for that matter, which kind of would be an interesting theological idea. But anyway, and there was a Polish, it's such a stupid digression, but I once occasionally, like completely randomly, read a piece of a Polish philosopher, I don't remember the name, from 17th century, like the start of the 17th century, and there was like he asks a question and answers it himself, like, what was God doing before he created the world? And the answer is, loved himself. Whatever you make of it. It's just funny recuerdos, funny memory. Anyway, okay, so the narrative is constructed, and it depends on the point of view again. All this subjective kind of stuff, all the bunch of interests and influences, etc., etc. And like, you might generalize that and state some trivial point, like a question always like forces whoever answers it into a very limited set of possible answers again. And again, so any question is a good way of forcing people into your own narrative, right? So you kind of push them into your framework where they cannot even get out of without like trying to dismantle the question itself, right? Which would probably make them even look weak or whatever. Let's get back to the topic. So the question presets the responses. That's what I'm saying. And okay, that would be a very long digression. No, let's just drop this point. Okay, so I wanted to go into a more philosophical rant about how, again, the experiment is impossible without the theory behind it, meaning that the raw data that we see in some statistical, sociological, let's say, table, it's not raw data. There's a theory behind it, meaning the experimenter, the scientist or whatever who's studying it, they had some presuppositions, and they've made it so that the experiment they made, meaning like probing the society with whatever means they were using, gave them answers according to this paradigm, this pre-existing theory they used, right? So without this theory, even the experiment would be impossible, even probing the society would be impossible. So when you're asking, like, who is going to win in presidential elections, Trump or Biden, you are assuming that only Trump and Biden can win, right? Or at least the respondent only recognizes these two candidates because, well, there were others, for example. So, yeah. And not even talking about many other things. All right, so there is no such thing as raw data, basically. That's what was the whole point of this long rant, sub-rant, let's say. Okay, well, that's one problem, that those agencies, even if they wanted to provide objective data, they couldn't, right? Okay, but they can even consciously, intentionally fiddle the data, right? And like, we've seen the evidence of that. I mean, it's not big news, hopefully, at least. We know of a lot of evidence of corruption, of all those kinds of things. And again, well, I'll just return to my point. Like, we have no way of knowing whether the bigger picture we are reported is true. Like, is just absolutely no way. It's like unfalsifiable, principally. Well, I mean, in most like ridiculous cases, if you would say like the population of the United States is one person, well, you can falsify it by observing another person, right? But I mean, in a reasonable framework, it is unfalsifiable. Okay, like let's say again a population of some country of China, let's say it's 1.4 billion. Like, how do you know? How do you know it's not 1.2 billion? It's still a heck of a lot, but would you be able to even like measure this difference somehow? Like, how would you do that? I don't know. I mean, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's really impossible. So 1.4 billion looks like a completely arbitrary figure. It might be 1 billion, it might even be 500 million, it might be 5 billion. I don't know, like, who knows really. And the same goes for economic data, for sociological data. Again, look at coronavirus cases. Like, you probably know of like dozens of examples of, again, how this presupposition influences the outcome, so to speak. Again, when a person had COVID diagnosed and they died, which means that they are put into this bin of people who died of COVID or something to that effect, right? Etc., etc. So yeah, so these are just illustrations of my point, that you might know, let's say, people who had COVID and died probably, or not died, or whatever, but you don't know the bigger picture, and that's the issue. And frankly, nobody knows probably. And this sort of corruption, this sort of fiddling of data is possible, and it's important to recognize that it's possible on both, let's say, high level, meaning in terms of hierarchy, social hierarchy, and low level. Let's say, again, we'll look at this proverbial agency that gathers data. So apparently they have some network of specialists or whatever who report the data. Let's say it's COVID cases. So they have, for example, each hospital reports to them, like, we had that many amount of diagnosed patients, that many of them died, that many of them recovered, etc. And they report that to whatever chief of healthcare, commission of whatever, who cares, right? So this lower level, let's say head of the hospital, or like some important doctor in this hospital who is responsible for this thing, is the lower level, right? So they may corrupt their data as well. So the higher level guy, like the minister of health or something, they may fiddle the data. So they may receive genuine data from hospitals and then fiddle it to serve whatever interests they're serving. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that even on the level of hospitals, there's still this corruption, and hospitals underreport the amount of cases or overreport. Again, who knows what their agenda is really currently. Perhaps if a certain hospital reports too many cases, they would be somehow punished, or they would be rewarded, or who knows what's going to happen. So there's a whole bunch of like hidden implicit incentives for them to do this, like whatever they're doing, under or over reporting, or, well, God knows, any sort of manipulation of data. So it's important to recognize, in my opinion, that it's not only the top shots who are necessarily responsible for all the problems of this sort. So even this proverbial agency that we have may have problems with like assessing the situation in the first place. It may not even have to fiddle anything because it already receives fiddled information. And again, in like heavily bureaucratized and like oppressive systems, you know, like the one we have in Belarus, for example, there's a lot of incentives for these lower level, you know, like government clerks or whatever, to do as the, you know, the bosses would like to, you know. So they tend to, let's say, kind of mute the problems that exist, etc. So in all those, you know, totalitarian, authoritarian regimes, that's the big problem, because you don't have objective, or at least any approximation of objective information up above, so you don't even know what your society is, which again is the problem of the bigger picture. And of course, even if they had information provided as it should have been, not necessarily it would be objective information, as we talked before. In fact, it would never be an objective information because, well, for philosophical, gnoseological reasons. All right. I feel like I've spent way too much time talking about this, which might be super obvious. I mean, what I'm talking about. So yeah, let's move on. So basically, we cannot know the society, you know. There is no like truth serum for the society because there's interested parties everywhere. Like we talked about this in the video Stories of History, how like history is full of politics, and that's what make it ultimately like unknowable, right? Well, the society is even more so filled with politics because, well, history, at least we can say, well, it was in the past, so people care a little bit less about it, right? But what happens today is certainly very relevant to everyone because everyone is living in today. Well, at least the people who are living still. So everyone is interested. So yeah, so there's politics everywhere. And yeah, so that way we arrive at this huge problem, which again, I repeat for the third or fourth time already, is the problem of the bigger picture, that we cannot acquire any sort of relevant picture of society because of reasons listed above and perhaps a little bit below. We'll see. Maybe there are like intelligence agencies, if you know what I mean, that have some info, like some genuine, true info, but who knows, really. All right, and to finish this segment, I wish to just even add to that another layer, which isn't about the bigger picture, but well, it kind of is. So the problem is that we cannot actually influence politics, right? So you can say, well, okay, there's interested parties everywhere. Well, can we like introduce the ultimate interested party, like the party of truth or something like that, which would demand all of these agencies to give us truthful, objective, correct data with no biases, with everything like described clearly, etc., etc. Can we have that, please? Well, no, because we cannot even make that demand in the first place, because we don't influence politics at all, or at least almost at all. Again, see our situation in Belarus, but you might think, or see the COVID situation in Europe and other places, and you might think, well, again, in America, well, it's the land of the free, etc., etc. But again, there have been plenty of studies that have shown that American people actually have almost zero influence on political decisions that are made, right? Political, economical, whatever types of decisions. So it's not at all influenced by the public. And well, I've said that there were plenty of studies, and I'll give you the link to one of them, which is, funnily enough, was published by Cambridge. Whereas, you may know, you may not know, that the difference between Oxford and Cambridge is that Oxford basically, from Oxford, let's say, true objective people graduate, right? Whereas from Cambridge, who graduates is rascals and liars, essentially. So Cambridge is like this nest of tricksters, I would say, whereas Oxford is more of a straightforward organization. That's like a very, very old division in British intellectual realm. But anyway, okay, so that was sort of like a tongue-in-cheek approach. So I cannot even give you a proof of my own point that wouldn't be spoiled inherently, which only reinforces the problem of the bigger picture. So I hope you appreciate the multiple layers of self-irony and at the same time, like, self-grandeur that it implies. Okay, so basically, yeah, we cannot really influence what happens in by we, I mean like a regular John, like you and me. I don't know who you are exactly because I don't see you, I don't know you probably, but I definitely don't influence politics, not in any way, shape, or form. All right, like people might say, well, it's basically all the same story. Like new government, whoever people elect, even if people elect them in the first place, they do the same things that the old people did, right? Like Trump says, well, Hillary is gonna go to jail, and wow, we are so very surprised she didn't, right? Or something to that effect. Like, who really cares? I mean, yeah. So a little bit of a more general comment before we go to the conclusion. So, as I've said, society, like a more gnoseological, if you like. So, society is constructed, right? Like it's. Well, I don't have any good synonym. It's really constructed by us, which is interestingly sounds like bias, but anyway, by us. From our point of view, as I've said, right? And like, just like history, it is full of politics. But at the same time, one thing I really wanted to mention here is that society doesn't even exist, interestingly enough. So that's a whole other level of problematics for the bigger picture. You see, what really is a society? When we're talking about concepts like that, like society or culture or government even, these are all phantoms. These are all virtual objects, if you like. Like, what is a government? It doesn't exist physically. There's no such thing as a government. You cannot, knock on it or something. It doesn't exist. The government essentially is a mode of behavior of people, right? So, in people, there is like a sub-circuit, let's say, in their behavioral patterns, which is responsible for the government. So this sub-circuit, let's say, and I don't mean that in any sort of magical, mystical, metaphysical sense, I mean it in practical sense. So this sub-circuit, so to speak, is responsible for, let's say, you complying to, I don't know, being taxed. So you just bring your money to some place and the other person takes your money, whether like physically or virtually again, and brings them to other place where they gather it in a big pile and then they spend it elsewhere, right? On their friends usually. So so all of that, this process, it's like, again, it's virtual, like it's there's no one really forcing you to do that. Like, of course, you know that if you evade paying taxes, again, there would be people with similar sub-circuit in their heads or elsewhere who would force you to do that or put you in jail, right? Or something like that. But ultimately, yeah, government is a mode of behavior. And that's it. It's not an object. It doesn't exist as an object. It's a virtual entity. And so is culture and country, and things like that. And we could have talked, like, I thought about it. I thought about talking about specifically like the maps, how maps evolved. Because again, maps are an example of this bigger picture type of thinking. Because what is a map? It's a representation of a larger object, let's say a country, on a smaller object, which is like a piece of paper this big, right? So, and it's highly non-trivial that you can map, literally in mathematical sense, it's called mapping, map one set of objects to the other set of objects, right? The whole country to this small sheet of paper, right? And the way you do that and all the procedures behind it, again, they imply some narrative and they imply some even intent. You're doing this having some sort of political interest behind. Let's say you want to depict where your major Air Force bases are in order to repel the possible attack of some enemy, right? So that's your interest, that's what you're mapping, and so you would do it in some particular way to fulfill this goal, right? To achieve this goal. Whatever, but I wouldn't talk about this because I thought that would be a little bit too much. But I gave you a little bit of that, so perhaps it would inspire you to think about it yourself. So what I'm saying is it's not trivial how you set this correspondence between one object and another, right? And all the procedures involved in it. Okay, so speaking about the conclusions, what we talked about in this video was the problem of the bigger picture, which is that your knowledge about the society is limited by your own perceptions, your own knowledge, your friends, and your own experiences, which are, again, inherently limited, subject to bias, blah, blah, blah. So the question is, how do you acquire a picture of the whole society? And the answer is, well, there are organizations that do that. But the problem is that the organizations themselves cannot acquire this data for various reasons, which I've listed above. In particular, they are biased themselves, the parts of them are biased, they may be corrupt, they are full of political interest, and there's a whole bunch of like larger scale philosophical problems of how you represent one object through the other, how can you, or rather, well, let's call it vaguely misrepresentation of reality. Whereas there's no such thing as reality. Like Stephen Hawking, in one of his books, he's also from Cambridge, I believe. But anyway, so in the shortest history of time, or there was like the brief history of time, but whatever. In one of those books, I mean, there was a larger one and then even a shorter one. So in one of these books, he says, there's like a phrase which repeats actually several times throughout the text, like reality, whatever it is. Like, so we're talking about objective reality, whatever it is. Yeah. So that's the problem of the bigger picture. And again, it's a problem. I don't have a solution for it. And I don't think anyone can have. Like, it's a fundamental issue. And we have to keep it in mind. And we have to keep in mind that anyone who claims to have the true data actually has just different data, you know? So it's not necessarily true. It's actually necessarily not true because none of this data is true and can be true even under the most perfect circumstances. Okay. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.